everything was now locked up in his office just in case, you know.
Really delighted to introduce Janet to give this public lecture. Janet is the Sargi Emeritus Professor of Economic History here at the LSE. A long time ago, Janet and I shared an office as researchers. She was working with Michio Morishima, and I was working with David Hendry, both in the economics department. And we had a kind of parallel careers from that point onwards. So Janet became the Sargi research lecturer. I've often wondered what that meant, but it sounds like it was a contradiction in terms if I was a lecturer and spending all my time sometimes speaking, teaching. Sargi research lecturer in Japanese economic and social history in 1984, and I followed her into the department a little while later. She became a full professor in the department and served as our head of department twice. Her CV lists many, many pages of scholarly work, wonderful and original journal articles, essays in books, books of her own, edited, single-authored. And these contributions are mostly, but not entirely, on Japanese economic and social history. They have a wider geographical spread, and they overlap into institutional history, business history, technological history. Of course, as a result, she's had many visiting professorships in Japan and the US and elsewhere, and she's fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Academy of Social Sciences. What is less well known to my colleagues in the department, perhaps, are that she has contributed substantially to LSE governance, sitting on many committees, councils, working groups. And at one point, you couldn't go to any meeting about research groups anywhere in the school or within the department if you were trying to set up a new research group when the Hunter report was quoted at you. Because Janet chaired a working group which laid out all the arrangements, levels, rules for research groups of any size, from the tiniest to the great big interdisciplinary ones with outside funding. So you always had to refer to the Hunter report, which governed all these matters. Perhaps unknown to many of us, both in the school department and her wider research network, is that in 2014 she was honoured with the award of the Order of the Rising Sun, gold raised with neck ribbon, by the government of Japan. I've never quite figured out where that sits in orders of things, but it's surely a high honour for service both to the community and I think the state as it's a sort of very broad recognition. I was lucky enough to be invited to the award ceremony in the gardens of the Japanese ambassador in London on a gloriously sunny late afternoon, a really memorable event, and I think that reflects and gives honour to Janet's contributions, both in academia and the wider society. So that's sort of appreciation of all the things that Janet has been doing and will surely continue to be doing in her scholarly work. Today we're going to be hearing about Janet's work on the Great Kantō Earthquake of 1923 with this wonderful poster dramatising the event. Soon I gather to be a monograph, which we're looking forward to. At some point, it's going to be a monograph that we're looking forward to. There will be time for questions at the end, so please do think them up, and there will be a reception afterwards to which we're all invited. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Mary. I think the only way now is down from what you described. And I should also start with something of an apology, in that I think there are some people here who've heard some of this before in an earlier form. I hope it is a bit more sophisticated. I hope there are new things. But more than anything else, it's a sort of exercise in thought. And I want to know what you think about it. So I really do hope you will have questions about it. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the Great Kantō Earthquake took place on the 1st of September 1923. Sorry, let me get right. And it happened just before noon, when, of course, people were cooking their midday meal. It was a powerful tremor, now estimated at about 8.3 on the Richter scale. But what was particularly damaging was that it had the epicenter was not that far from the capital area, and it was also shallow in the bay. And the tremors were felt hundreds of miles away. It was, by any standard, a big earthquake. And it was followed by a tsunami and, most devastatingly, fire. The number of deaths are somewhat debated. The more sensationalist ones say 140,000, the more academic ones say 110,000 plus. And it was estimates suggest that something like 40% of the buildings in Tokyo were mostly burnt down or were destroyed, and 90% of the buildings in Yokohama, the main port city. And so, you know, you get this sort of, it's difficult to exaggerate how seriously this was viewed, and writers have talked of it as one of the 20th century's worst natural disasters. And obviously over the months and the weeks that followed, there were countless personal tragedies played out as individuals, families and organisations coped with grief, loss and the challenges of survival. It threatened the livelihoods of those who survived, it threatened the functioning of government and other institutions, and it threatened the capital's core role in an increasingly centralised political and economic system. Yokohama was the country's main export port and was unable to operate because of the destruction. The nationwide communications and transport networks, in which Tokyo was a nodal point, suffered major disruption. So you've got damage to buildings, infrastructure, productive capacity, and stored commodities, not to mention personal effects, furniture, works of art, you name it, it was there. And rebuilding and recovery was to prove a very costly exercise. And I can't quite match the picture of the elephant that was there. But if you look at some of the contemporary photographs, they depict very graphically the horrors of what occurred. This is post-fire, but the destruction is obvious. People walking down the street. This is a picture of the fire over central Tokyo, and this, somewhat to the delight of some people, is the central police station. So, what am I going to focus on? This is part of a broader research project, and my research objective is essentially to try and understand better how a disaster of this kind impacts on a market economy. What I want to do in this sort of, over the next sort of 45, 50 minutes is to focus more on contemporary Japanese analysis of the economic impact. How did people at the time look at, observe and interpret what was going on? And a number of questions, I think, come out of this. Firstly, there seems to me to be a disparity between the amount of scholarly research on the economic dimension of the disaster, subsequent scholarly research, which is not that great, and the very voluminous contemporary literature on the topic. So at the time, people were writing huge amounts, and then after a certain point, the studies were actually very limited. I'm interested in how far economic theory informed both secondary literature, but also the importance of the writing at the time. And I want to say something about how the economics of disasters has allowed us to ask new questions of the historical data, and then think about how that sort of more recent theoretical work relates to what Japanese writers were writing and analysing at the time. And just to sort of foreshadow the sort of main points that I want to make, I think it's fair to say that earlier economics approaches have both constrained and informed the secondary literature. Obviously they've made people ask certain questions and focused on certain things, but they've also contributed to a neglect of other aspects. The economics of disasters, and there may be people here who know more about it than I do, but it seems to have been relatively slow to develop as a sort of branch of economic theory. But what is undoubtedly the case is that it has increasingly provided us with new ways of asking questions and framing rigorous analysis, which is something that I've been looking for to try and analyse the case of 1923. The contemporary analysis, I would argue, was intensified by the fact that the disaster struck the capital area. Because it was the region around the capital, that's why it got more attention from contemporaries than had it occurred in another part of Japan. But it was above all informed by the fact that Japan had a history of recurrent earthquakes. So if you put it into a longer term perspective, yes, this might have been particularly large, but they were observing and analysing phenomena with which they were already familiar. And I would argue that in 1920s Japan, what they were saying in many ways foreshadows what the later theorists in the economics of disasters learned to sort of formalize in a more formal way. Now, I'm not sure what that tells us, but it's something that I think is sort of interesting, that you get this overlap, if you like. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a bit about the historiography, talk about some of the theories that relate to what I've been trying to do, and then explore in a bit more depth the contemporary commentary. Okay, if we think of the secondary literature, and I'm not going to sort of go into this in detail, there is a big secondary literature on the Kantō earthquake disaster. And not surprisingly, last year, the centenary of the disaster, there was a sort of flurry of special issues and people collecting papers of it. But the vast bulk of the literature does not relate to the economic dimension. Interesting. There's lots on the sort of political, social, and cultural consequences and the response to that. Reconstruction, in some ways, sort of reconstruction seems to be more important than what happened. And you can see there's a sort of logic to that. There's quite a lot on the visual side, the sort of art and the photography and the literature of the thing. And it has a big place in longer term histories of seismology and people's understanding of earthquakes and how they prepare for them. And particularly notable, of course, was that, like some other disasters, the Kantō earthquake in September 1923 generated enormous social disruption and persecution and murder of minority communities, Chinese, Koreans, and left-wing Japanese, some of whom were murdered in police stations. And unsurprisingly and appropriately, I think there is a huge literature on that particular dimension. But in general, and particularly until the last sort of 15, 20 years, the number of studies of the economic dimension has actually been surprisingly limited. And it's that for me, sort of contrasts with the volume of contemporary 1920s accounts that we tend to find. What there is consists of both a few overview studies. There was a very interesting looking project at Shotsubashi University in the 1980s, which produced a number of sort of occasional papers. But then it didn't seem, it seemed to peter out and nothing happened. And, you know, the reasons which are not clear to me. And then you get more specialised analyses, quite a lot on the financial and monetary impact, because that is the one area where it's acknowledged to have been a major contributory factor in a financial crisis that occurred in 1927 and is very tied up in terms of, you know, the financial system and financial stability. There's been work on accounting because people lose their records. What does this mean for keeping business accounts? Things of that kind. And how they sort of reconstruct the data that a business needs to rebuild itself. There's been a lot of work done over the past sort of 10 years or so on a sort of economic geography dimension, both in terms of how it impacts on the position of the capital in relation to the country, but also the location of industry within the capital. Does it move out of destroyed areas to other areas and things of that kind? And so there are sort of bits and pieces on insurance, on labour and employment, on regional business, on the impact on health. But it is very much focused in the last sort of 20 years or so. And so you've got this long space from about the early 1930s right through to about the 1980s. Nobody is really writing or trying to analyse what is going on. And that seemed to me to sort of, you know, I was curious to know why this might be the case. And I think one of the things that has contributed to it is that the attempts that have been made by economists and economic historians to measure the impact of the disaster, you know, to try and sort of measure what it means for the economy. And there's a huge amount of statistical data, which I'll come back to, which relates to different categories of damage and losses in specific areas. And obviously, over the course of that time period, measuring these things has been more and more facilitated by the development of new techniques and the ability to handle data. And the most recent estimates suggest that the damage occurring from the disaster in 1923 was something over 1/3 of the country's GNP the previous year. And that includes sort of building structures, production capacity, physical infrastructure. And that's pretty big. And I give for comparison, you know, the estimate for the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, which is much smaller but still very serious, which is estimated to reduce US GDP by 100%. So these numbers are big, but at the same time, when you locate them within the country's sort of longer term, the economy's longer term trajectory, all the data suggests only a sort of slight and temporary downturn. Now, obviously, there's all sorts of problems, which we can come back to, but I mean, just for one sort of example, you've got 1923 here. Yes, there's an indicator of things not doing so well. But by comparison to when you get the Great Depression of the early 1930s, it looks pretty small and insignificant. And so I think there has been a view that it didn't really matter. If it doesn't affect the longer term trajectory, it doesn't really matter. And so you've got this sort of apparent absence of the long-term macroeconomic impact. And if you take a whole host of indicators, most of them revert to trend within the most of a few years. One or two will take 6 or 7 years, but most seem to be going that trend. And that seemed for, I think, many economists to reinforce very long-standing assumptions that really do these kinds of major disasters make a big difference to economies over the long term. It is not to say they don't make a difference in the very short term. Clearly, they turn people's lives upside down. But at the same time, and I mean, and this goes back, to a long way. John Stuart Mill talks about the disappearance in a short time of all traces of the mischiefs done by earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, and the ravages of war. And that's mirrored by quite a lot of the sort of, the commentary on these kinds of events. And much more recently, Adam too has talked about economic historians having a way of making disasters disappear from the long-run trajectory. But obviously, this is only part of the story. Such indicators have significant limitations, of course, in terms of overall measurement of the economic impact of disasters, and what it can actually tell us. And as I say, it's clear that there's always a very significant short or even medium-term impact. And even some of the sort of measurements that have been done much more recently by those working on the economics of disasters show that under certain circumstances, even the longish-term economic impact is very significant. So, are present-day disasters different from the ones in the past? Is it just we've got better data or whatever? What they do tend to conclude is that for developing economies, and of course Japan in 2023 is still a developing economy, the impact has the potential to be greater, and this may not necessarily emerge in calculations. So I think in response to this, a lot of the more recent research does go below this aggregate level and seeks to explore how far the disaster changed or shaped significant aspects of the economy, whether it influenced technological change, so that this sort of short, medium term is actually what really matters. The more sort of historical approach has highlighted, of course, how quantification has very little to say about certain important dimensions, like the lived economic experiences of individuals and small groups. And I think quite a sort of nice summary by one pair of historians writing on disasters is the consequences of a nature-induced shock are partially endogenous, as those consequences are dictated by the arrangement of societies that they come into contact with. So what interests me is that interaction, the arrangement of societies, and where we look for ideas below the macro level. So I sort of started off looking at the economic history of disasters and then looking at the economics of disasters to sort of see what ideas I could have. And if you look at the economic history of disasters, much of the work is, which has focused, I think, on these sort of long-term disasters, slow disasters, I would sort of call them. Particularly famines, of course. I mean, the work there will be familiar to most people here. And a lot of that work does focus on the way in which these disasters are caused, exacerbated and alleviated by the operation of the market. It's the core. But if you look at one-off shocks of the kind of disaster, volcanic eruption or whatever, there's much less focus on this kind of thing. There's quite a big literature on disaster as opportunity. It allows new things to happen. That's, again, will depend on the time period we're looking at. But in the case of one-off disasters, a lot of the focus is on rebuilding and recovery rather than trying to understand the mechanisms that occur whereby the disaster impacts the economy. Certainly, some of the more recent developments, over the last 50 years, shall we say, in economics has helped us to ask new questions and structure new arguments. The new institutional economics, behavioural economics, and economic geography. But that still doesn't necessarily or I found that it didn't really tell me, well, how can I formalise and structure an analysis of markets in the wake of a disaster of this kind. So I turned to the economics of disasters and found very rapidly that they can't agree on what a disaster is. There are multiple definitions. I give a couple here. A rapid, sustained, or prolonged impact of the geophysical world on human life and socio-economic needs and support. A natural event that causes a perturbation in the functioning of the economic system with a significant negative impact. Or a coming together of a natural hazard with a volume of people and assets that can be affected and the susceptibility to damage. All of them, they've got this interaction between geophysical and the human society. But some of them actually say, well, the definition of a disaster will depend on who's writing about it. Great. What I think they do have in common, though, despite this lack of definition, is an assumption that natural catastrophes and disasters are embedded in historical patterns of vulnerability and resilience. And what I found was that there was a particular focus in much of this literature that had emerged mostly from the 1970s onwards on three main issues. One is the operation of the market. One is mechanisms of geographical diffusion of impact. And the third was the economic behaviour of groups and individuals. And I want to say something about each of these because they then come up in the 1920s literature from Japan. So market operation. They've been explicit in this developing literature in emphasising the importance of the laws of supply and demand if you're going to analyse markets in a post-disaster period. They highlight that the market is no longer in equilibrium, prices are out of equilibrium, credit mechanisms will be disrupted, and there's a loss of trust because that's connected to the absence of credit, the absence of security, and whatever. And they also highlight the existence or the potential existence of exchange rate and balance of payments problems under such circumstances. But basically, they're reinforcing the fact that it is supply and demand and the pricing of the market that is the most important thing in a post-disaster economy. In terms of mechanisms of geographical diffusion, what they've highlighted is that physical damage generates additional costs. You've got the direct costs, as they would argue, of immediate physical damage, but then you've got what they call the indirect costs, which include things like a reduction in the flow of goods and services, loss of aggregate earnings, lower effective demand. The things which are much more difficult to measure than actual physical damage. And what they have increasingly argued is that the economic impact from one of these sort of one-off natural disasters is diffused particularly through indirect costs, through what they refer to as ripple effects. And the mechanisms for these ripples sort of spreading out are shifts in supply and demand of a whole range of commodities, transport and utility disruption, state intervention, which can move in different ways, and market structures, production structures, supply chains, patterns of market integration. Now, in many respects, I think it's the case that these sort of ripple effects, we tend to take these for granted. We're familiar with seeing disruption in global supply chains. If you get something happening in one part of the world, then it disrupts the supply chains elsewhere. But theorizing these mechanisms seems to be surprisingly recent. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but the literature that I've looked at, it's really quite late that people talk about, about these ripple effects in terms of the ways in which economies function after disasters. And thirdly, you get the economic behaviour of groups and individuals. And the economists working on disasters talk about how people modify their market behaviour in the wake of a disaster. People make different decisions from those they might make under other circumstances. Indeed, they use the word, in earlier work, use the word behaviour is somewhat peculiar. And so increasingly, you've got this suggestion that in this kind of post-disaster context, people do not behave in relation to the market in the way that they might otherwise, and that this can be extremely predictable. I mean, Singleton says both judgment and behaviour may be clouded by favouritism, misperception and emotion, especially when crucial decisions have to be made at a time of extreme stress. And obviously at the same time, what you have is some attempts to replace a market. So you've got sort of social welfare, relief activities, which, may push people in a different direction from, the sort of normal market activity. And what you've got is a situation in which there's a lot of sympathy around. Altruism, cooperation, that can be very widespread under these circumstances, and it may constrain people's desire to make profits. But at the same time, it may also offer people opportunities to make profits or to act in a different way in terms of their interests. So there's a sort of interesting combination in terms of how do people act in relation to the economy in these kinds of circumstances, and how far is it highly individual and extremely unpredictable? Who is going to do what? So those three elements are extremely important, I think. They're major parts of the sort of more recent theorising that has gone on. And what I'd like to do is to sort of try and follow them through in terms of the contemporary assessment, the analysis that people undertook in the 1920s. The initial response was, this is of course a disaster. The picture is actually the city of Yokohama. Not much left. And government reports by the Bureau of Social Affairs said, we're not going to recover from this. It's apparently arrested, as was apprehended at the time, the progress of national development. destruction, this comes from the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce, the economic organisation of the imperial capital has been destroyed almost down to its very foundations. And if you look at the contemporary writing, the two words that jump out, everybody uses them. One is unprecedented, bizarre, and the second is unimaginable. It's beyond our imagination. What? So you've got this enormous flurry of extremely gloomy comment. And if just to sort of give you a sense of you know, why you might get so much writing. I mean, despite the gloomy comment, you've got over a period of 3 or 4 years a huge amount of description and analysis of the economic impact and the consequences. And it comes from government at all levels, local, regional, sort of the smallest village, journalists, academic, businessmen, and organisations. So it's very, very diverse. And the sheer volume, I have to confess, creates a major problem for the researcher. There's always something else to read. And one of the reasons that there is so much comment, I think, is because it is seen as integral to the reconstruction process. It's only by understanding what you've lost, what has been happening, the sort of mechanisms whereby the impact might spread or whatever, that you can take appropriate measures for recovery and rebuilding. So that sort of analysis is integral to the whole reconstruction plan. The volume of analysis and description, though, wanes very rapidly from the early 1930s. It sort of doesn't go, but obviously the sort of major impacts in terms of things like finance, that sort of passed, so it goes down. There is this view, well, we've managed to recover, we're okay, so we don't need to write about it anymore. Survivors, not surprisingly, want to look forward and rebuild. They don't want to harp on what's been happening. Memory retreats, as is always going to be the case. And there's no doubt that the economic impact is overshadowed by arguably much greater disasters, even greater disasters. The Great Depression, I showed you, has a much more significant impact at the aggregate level. And for many people, at the personal level. And then you get the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War. So people are facing significantly greater problems, and they're not going to, you know, this is in the past, we've dealt with it, let's move on. Like later scholars, people at the time did measure the impact. I mean, the Japanese authorities were inveterate data collectors. Now, much of that data is not necessarily very good, but there's a hell of a lot of it. And really, right from the start, after the earthquake, you've got people beginning to measure. Again, part of the reconstruction process. If you can measure and cost what you've lost, then you know what you're doing. You're better able to plan what's going to go on. And so you get these extraordinarily detailed itemizations of the physical damage to production capacity, infrastructure and goods, and then they seek to put a monetary value on it. I mean, if you wanted to know how the extent of the damage to factories making cakes in a particular locality of Tokyo, they would tell you. You know, it's incredibly detailed. But what that means is, because everybody's trying to do it, they come up with hugely diverse estimates of what the total cost is. You know, I mean, it could, one chamber of commerce in Osaka said, well, it could be 300 million yen, but it could be 10 billion yen. You know. It's very difficult to sort of estimate. I mean, the Toyo Keizai Shimpo, which was one of the sort of leading economics magazine, just a month after the earthquake, attempted what it called the best estimates of the time. And that suggested that a third of all business capital was impacted, 43% in commerce, 27% in transport, 50% in chemical industry, 82% of department stores. Because obviously some things like the chemical industry were highly concentrated in that area. So Japan's chemical industry was severely damaged, whereas some other industries which were focused elsewhere in the archipelago were much less impacted. But even allowing for that, the contemporary estimates suggested that a sizable part of Japan's production capacity had been negatively impacted in one way or the other, either destruction or at least damage. So measuring becomes very important in the contemporary analysis. But if we think of the three elements in the in the more recent literature, what we tend to find is that Japanese commentators are doing somewhat the same thing. First of all, they analyse market disruption. They, across the board, and it's very, very striking if you look at the literature, there is a focus on the market economy as the mechanism which determines the economic impact of the physical disruption and the collective and individual responses to it. Markets, they just come up. Everything you read, it's market, market. And they recognise that markets could no longer function properly due to things such as loss of supplies, physical destruction, loss of personnel, and transport and utility disruption. They talk about shifts in supply and demand, complaints of shortages and surpluses. They talk about price rises for some commodities and price falls for others. So price rises for those with them in short supply, and of course price falls for others where the market has maybe, the consumer market maybe has ceased to exist for a while. And so they're very aware that markets function in this way. And that leads, of course, to attempts to intervene in the market. Mainly by the state, to ensure supplies of needed goods, to try and control prices and to plan for rebuilding. So they have heavy restrictions on limits on wholesale price changes. Retail prices are somewhat more problematic. But you also get intervention by groups and organisations to procure inputs, to try and find markets for their surplus production. So you've got sort of a reliance on the market and a recognition that it's having this kind of impact. And then you've got people trying to intervene to sort of limit the damage that this is going to do to themselves, mainly. And we find that the intervention had both, as people report, had both positive and negative effects for the country, for its different regions, and for individuals. It certainly contributed to major exchange rate and balance of payments problems. And what you find, for example, is people in one part of the country saying, yeah, but they've controlled the prices in Tokyo for such and such a commodity, but that's bad for us because then we don't get so much. So you've got intervention in different ways. What you do find, though, despite this intervention, there's very little attempt to substitute for the market. They're trying to rig the market, but they're not trying to replace the market. So there is an exception that an acceptance that the market is what you are relying on. And so you get these phrases such as, what we need to do is ensure the smooth supply of goods. You've got markets. Any intervention is aimed at trying to make the market work better and achieve the objectives that we want. They also talked extensively about the diffusion of the impact of the disaster. Because you've got this consensus that markets are important, that goes along with a consensus that markets are the key means whereby the impact of the disaster was diffused across the country. And they recognized that price changes at the scene of the disaster would then spread out and be communicated all around. And because Japan in the 1920s had a relatively high degree of market integration, that obviously facilitated the diffusion of that impact. Tokyo, they reported repeatedly, was in its core position as in the national communications and transport infrastructure. So, for example, if you sat in Osaka and you wanted to communicate with Hokkaido, which is right in the north, you went via Tokyo. So it was a sort of nodal point there. And the contemporary analysis highlighted this integration and what it meant for the diffusion of the impact. The area around Tokyo and Yokohama was also a supplier of goods, particularly to the northern half of the country. And so this integration magnified the effect and spread it geographically. What they also emphasized was that Yokohama, which had been so badly destroyed, was having the same effect, but internationally. Because Yokohama was the link between Japan's producers, Japan's export producers, and international markets. So your impact could be spread out, reaching as far as New York, which received a lot of Japanese goods, particularly silk. And the net effect that they described was that you've got very divergent fortunes resulting from this between communities and regions across Japan. Some are doing okay, some are not. You've got a lot of internal rifts, which are the result of very diverse impacts rippling out from the centre. And those divergent fortunes and interests, and indeed the conflicts that emerge between communities and regions in different parts of Japan over this, suggests that the idea that the Japanese government tried to portray that we've recovered and we've all worked together and it's all national solidarity is actually little more than this. It doesn't work. And if you look in particular at this regional impact, the spreading out of the impact, I mean, you can find endless comments on this. The managing director of Mitsui Bank, one of the biggest banks, he reported that the earthquake was a national disaster. It's not just a local disaster. He highlighted the damage to communications, and he highlighted the fact that drops in consumption, say for things like luxury goods in the capital area, meant a fall in local production in lots of Japan's regional areas, and spread recession across the country. And that was echoed by many others. Here I've given an example, the economist Horia Kiichi, who highlighted the fact that difficulties in Tokyo meant difficulties everywhere. And this was not just towns, this was country. The head of the Tokyo University of Agriculture said that voices calling for the revival of the capital are very loud, but those calling for the revival of markets are very quiet. Tokyo is not just the capital, but an economic city. It needs to be restored as an economic centre as well. The economies of Tokyo, on the other hand, must be rebuilt for the sake of the countryside. So they're describing very explicitly how the integration of markets across the nation is a critical factor in the recovery process. And thirdly, they talk about economic behaviour. They talk about how the disaster has modified the market behaviour of groups and individuals. And the fact that you get this combination of altruism and profiteering. And very early, within a fortnight of the disaster, you've got the government trying to intervene to stop profiteering. This is from the official statement. What calls for special apprehension is that taking advantage of this unparalleled natural calamity that has befallen the nation, individual merchants or mercantile corporations may indulge in the practice of cornering or secretly hoarding the stocks of necessities of living for the selfish purpose of profiteering. And you get widespread comments that people have used the disaster as an excuse not to pay their debts, to try and benefit themselves. And yet, at the same time, we know that the amount of aid which was generated in the provinces for the disaster area was enormous. So you've got this combination. Is this the peculiar behaviour that disaster economists have highlighted, perhaps? So you've got this kind of focus. And I want to sort of finish by focusing on one particular text, which is this text. The stated objective of the book is to produce an economic history of the Great Kantō Earthquake that will also serve as a reference source for the business world for the future. And it embodies the three elements that we haven't mentioned. So what do we know about this book? And I was somewhat gratified that when I talked about this in Japan, nobody had heard of this book, even the people who had written on the Great Kantō Earthquake, which surprised me because it is available online from the National Diet Library. And finding out about who he was has proved extraordinarily difficult. We don't even know how his name was pronounced. We know what the characters for his name are. And we think it was Ikeuchi, but it might be Ikenouchi. And nobody could help me. He graduated from a private university in 1911. He lived in the US for about 10 years, studying applied economics at the University of California. So he would have been familiar with some of the aftermath of the San Francisco earthquake. At the time of the earthquake, as far as we can tell, he was an advisor to various Japanese businesses, lived in Osaka, so outside the disaster area. And he later stood as a guard candidate in Hokkaido, in the northernmost island of Japan. He didn't get elected. But we actually know very little about him. What is the case is he was clearly a committed researcher and a very rapid writer. The book appeared less than 3 months after the disaster. It runs to well over 300 pages. It contains huge amounts of data. So if anybody wants a lesson on how to write a book quickly, this is what you should be looking at. So does he highlight? As I say, he provided an immensely detailed description, lots of in-depth data, a detailed inventory, physical damage. But unlike most of the other commentators, he sought to offer a more formal framework for trying to analyse what he saw. And he argued that the disaster had three main categories of effects, what he called natural effects, and he divided these into direct effects and indirect effects. Again, making this distinction between direct effects, human and material damage and destruction, and indirect effects, shortages and surpluses, unemployment, bankruptcies, etc. He also highlighted what he called regional effects, which he said resulted from direct links through economic organizations and transactions, the demand for goods from production areas, the sort of rural-urban nexus, and the regional economic balance between Kanto, which was the region round Tokyo and Yokohama, and Kansai, which is the region round Osaka. And he also talked about man-made effects, which is how he summarized actions by the authorities and other institutions and organizations. So unlike most of his contemporaries, he was actually trying to put out some kind of model for how a post-disaster economy may work and what the mechanisms are. So, in many ways, what I would like to argue is that these views, these analyses, have an enormous resonance with, and somewhat to my surprise, I have to confess, with recent theory. In terms of analysing markets, there's a recognition that disaster shifts both supply and demand schedules and the market ceases to be in equilibrium. And this is going to be shown in terms of price changes unless things are controlled. They recognise that price changes were not always in line with actual supply and demand. They get manipulated. They also showed a significant understanding of the disparity between trends in retail and wholesale prices. Wholesale prices were much easier to control than retail prices. And hence profiteering was likely to concentrate on the retail sector, which you couldn't control, that depended on the individual. So they're talking about very much about the same thing, I think. In terms of the diffusion of economic impact, you've got this extensive analysis of ripples that transform a local disaster into a national one, with an understanding of direct versus indirect costs. And as I've said, they highlight what facilitates the diffusion of the impact. This high degree of market integration, a relatively centralized economy, the destruction of a focal area for export activity, which sort of spreads it further, and the net result being the shifting patterns of supply and demand, and the price changes get spread right across the country and even beyond. In some cases, helped by intervention. And any form of reconstruction had to bear in mind that this was going on. And the resonance in terms of their comments on economic behaviour is, I think, also very conspicuous. There's a clear understanding that altruism and cooperation could constrain the profit-making class, but that individuals and groups would also seek to maximise profit and personal interest. So you've got this sort of coexistence. People are torn in different directions. And a lot of this was actually embodied in the disruption of credit and finance due to loss of assets and records and loss of trust. And what you find, which is described almost everywhere, is there's basically a reversion to cash dealings because people no longer feel that they can trust anybody else. So the basis of credit is not there. Cash dealings, barter, and in some cases, unsecured lending. So just to conclude, I think you've got this disparity between the volume of contemporary analysis and later scholarship is linked to the fact that they recover relatively quickly. It's linked in some ways to economic and economic historical approaches, and the fact that Japan is particularly prone to such disasters, so they maybe deal with it in a different way. The contemporary analysis was informed by understanding, I think, from a long history of exposure to and thinking about natural disasters. This was unprecedented, as they said, but at the same time they were familiar with the phenomenon because it had happened before. So there's that in-depth practical experience. In some cases, and I think the case of Ikeuchi suggests that, you've also got a very high level of business and economics training, and in some cases experience of disasters outside Japan. So they've got something to compare it with. You can see what's going on, and that's something which there isn't a great deal of work being done on, and it would be interesting to pursue, I think. So in some ways, I think the economics disasters has provided us with a more coherent framework for thinking about these things. But in some ways, you feel that Ikeuchi and his contemporaries would have been terribly surprised by what they found there. Not to say it's not useful, but in a sense, it's sort of these are sort of precursors, if you like. But even if we sort of admire all this sort of serious analysis, which I do, that did not mean that Japanese contemporaries, like others under that 7%, did not sort of have other concerns. Now, I'll leave you with this picture. This is a kannon of the bodhisattva of compassion being saved because one of the things that the earthquake did, the disaster did, was it produced all sorts of predictions that this was not only this was the end of the world, but that this was a punishment for what had been going on. So the spiritual dimension is still heavily ahead. And with that, I will stop because that's more than enough.
Thank you very much, Janet. I hope there's lots of questions brewing, but maybe I can just start with one while you were generating lots more. Given how many disasters they had before, had they not developed some kind of a generic recipe? I mean, this might be asking too much, but I was struck in the Great Depression that different countries respond to this in completely different ways. There's no sort of general recipe about what you should do. But in terms of these natural disasters, you talked a lot about the effects, and I'm just wondering the recipe. They didn't seem to have a standard recipe about what they should do at this point.
I think there is a standard recipe in terms of recognizing what is needed in terms of aid in the immediate aftermath. I think there are I would say there are probably sort of three major elements that make this less the case. One is that you have a revolution in 1868. And so you've got a completely different national structure. Before that, earthquake relief is very much the province of the local lord, who is sort of responsible for it. And there is an accepted view that they have an obligation to look after the people in the vicinity in the aftermath. Whereas now you've got regional government, but One is that this is the capital area. It's the following, the change of government, the major disasters that have taken place have all been outside the capital, or most of them have been outside the capital. So you've got something, A, which is on a very large scale, and B, it is a capital area with a centralised economy. And the market integration, I think, is, again, it's sort of, in earlier times, it was much easier to sort of localise it. Yes, you were bringing supplies from outside. This is giving it a different dimension. So yes, there are certain expectations, but the economy has changed so much over the previous sort of 40 years. And the character of the devastated area has changed so much. And I think that probably makes it more difficult.
I think I saw Safia's hand first, so maybe you could just introduce and say who you are when you're asking your question for those who don't know you.
Hi everyone, I'm Safia, LSE Fellow in the Department of Economic History and a fan of Janet's work. I have a question regarding the businesses that develop, and you were talking about how they, would become competitive, and I thought that was very interesting. Sorry, I thought it was very interesting how you're talking about the lack of cohesion that developed. And I was wondering whether, you could also think of it as opportunity for some businesses to be able to develop something quite unique. And I was sort of thinking about, let's say, the COVID disaster that we might have, and we see, all these vaccine companies suddenly taking full advantage, and you have, Zoom taking full advantage. So do you see something similar like that happening in the wake of
Yes is the answer. You get regions across Japan, and you find sort of local chambers of commerce and local businessmen saying, "Aha, this is our opportunity," and there are sort of bitter disputes that result. So, I mean, the most famous one is that Yokohama has a monopoly on the export of raw silk, which is the most important, most valuable export Japan has. Most of it goes to the States. And the port of Kobe in the west has long been trying to sort of get a share of this trade. And when the earthquake hits, they're terribly sympathetic. They say, "Aha, this is our chance. We'll help them out by temporarily taking some of the burden because the ships won't go." And there's a most bitter dispute which results, where was the people in Yokohama saying they're trying, they use this wonderful analogy of they're trying to channel the water away from our rice fields to their rice fields. And it goes on for months. Yokohama eventually sort of survived. But there are very, very significant disputes between them. There are even disputes between Yokohama and Tokyo, both of which have been destroyed. Because the central government based in Tokyo, Yokohama is only, 25 miles away or something. They say it's much more important to rebuild Tokyo than it is to build Yokohama. Whereas people in Yokohama say, look, they're more badly destroyed. So it's, I think, I wouldn't say that nation is not important, because particularly when you go externally, your image as a nation is important. But I think, the rhetoric the government promotes about that is all part of the creating a nation, which Japan has been desperately trying to do since the 1870s. Because before that it wasn't really a nation in many respects. So it's sort of, yes, you're absolutely right. There are mass accusations of the non-damaged areas and regions trying to capitalise and encroach on the established position of the damaged regions.
Kent.
Oh, Thank you, Janet.
Sorry, do you need the? Do
You
need
can
the
you can
mic?
shout.
Well, it's also because it gets into the recording. So.
Thank you.
Oh yes,
Okay.
of course.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm Ken Deng, and I used to share EH221 with Janet.
228.
To the whole. The course is called Economic Development of Japan, India, and Russia. So here we go. Two questions related. One is, what happened to the insurance premium after the earthquake in these two cities? Plus, has Japan already achieved gold standard in its currency? Use gold standard at that time. Anyway, they raised huge sum of foreign debt. Thank you.
Let me deal with the second one first. Japan was not on the gold standard. Japan had suspended its affiliation to the gold standard during World War I, and was trying to deflate its domestic its currency to get back on the gold standard, because the Japanese prices had risen more than those of many other currencies, and so it was considered overvalued. So they were desperately trying to deflate the economy to get back on the gold standard, but it was not. So it was effectively floating. It's not until 1930 that they get back on the gold standard, and then it's very short-lived because it's disastrous at that time.
Premium.
The insurance premiums. Well, you could write a book on the insurance industry. I don't propose to. One of the biggest problems they had, well, I suppose there were sort of two major problems, and Anthony you may have looked into it in British insurance companies in relation to this, I don't know. Is one that most of the Japanese insurance companies are then linked in for reinsurance to Lloyd's. So there's a sort of international dimension. But the other element, which is in some ways more important, is that there are huge debates. There is earthquake insurance, there is fire insurance, but what it tends not to cover is if you've got an earthquake which then causes a fire, and so what you get is a lot of Japanese insurance companies initially saying we're not going to pay out because an earthquake is a sort of, it's sort of, there's nothing we can do about earthquakes, so we can't do it. And our fire insurance, because it was caused by the earthquake, does not cover it. So the government eventually has to sort of set up a commission to try and sort out the insurance problem. I mean, they look a lot to San Francisco, because San Francisco had the same problem in 1906, because there's a huge fire after the earthquake there. But it's a really difficult problem, because earthquakes were accepted as going to happen. Therefore, how you do that. So in general, yes, you're probably right. Premiums do go up. But in this case, it becomes a real political and it's a real business trauma, because if businesses can't get insurance on destroyed buildings, it's usually, or stocks, it's usually problematic. So it becomes a very, very big issue. I have a feeling that the Japanese Federation of Insurance Companies has actually written a history.
Eric.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, I'm Eric Schneider and have benefited greatly from Janet's help over the years. I wanted to ask you though, because of your three kind of schema, there was one thing that I thought could fit maybe in 2 and 3 that you didn't mention, and that didn't seem to come out of the theory, which is migration.
Yeah.
And you see it, I guess, like in the Hurricane Katrina response, right? That people left New Orleans and they didn't come back, right? So I mean, there's a medium, long run effect there, but there's also a short run effect. And Tokyo is a growing city in this period. People are coming from elsewhere. Do people go home? until their homes were rebuilt or until their jobs were restored. And is that a way in which the kind of earthquake is having kind of knock-on effects on other regions as well?
Yeah. No, I mean, no, you're absolutely right. There is a very significant departure of population from Tokyo. And I mean, at this time, I mean, as you will know, many people in Tokyo have families in somewhere in the countryside. So many of them have places to go to. You can rely on family. A very high proportion eventually go back. And some of them go back before their houses are rebuilt. You know, I mean, they sort of find what they think is the place, and then they do something up. But what you also get is the attraction of new people going into Tokyo and Yokohama, either to help with the reconstruction. I mean, the demand for construction workers sort of goes through the roof, and the wages go up. So people say, well, I can make lots of money by going there. So many of them stay. But what you also find is that one of the effects of the disaster, because it happens in the core and in the industrial areas, it tends to sort of move things further out, at least temporarily, and then that gets sort of ensconced. So you get the suburbs developing more. So it's easier for people who come from the outside to sort of try and find places to live and what have you. There are some who never go. If you look at some businesses, you know, they decamp their head offices and then they decide that they're not going back. The vast majority of businesses go back. They rebuild. And because the rebuilding itself generates an increased demand for labour, labour of particular kind, but I mean, it tends to sort of draw it in. So the population of Tokyo recovers pretty quickly, surprisingly quickly, in a way, more than you might expect. The calculation is made more difficult because what they do not very long afterwards is they change what they measure as Tokyo. You know, Tokyo grows. I mean, you may have come across that in your stats, and so that makes it more difficult to know exactly who's going where. But it is certainly an important dimension.
Okay, just behind Eric. Just back from Japan, I think, are you?
Yeah.
Tom. Yeah. And then we're going to go to Colin next. So.
Yeah, Tom Learmouth, PhD, Transit Department, supervised by Janet. So with the Ikeuchi study, I was wondering, did he offer any predictions about what would happen over the next few months and years? Because it was so soon after the event itself.
It was.
And if he did, were they correct? Like, what was his track record?
No, he was quite cautious, actually. He didn't. I mean, he said it was lessons for the future, but he saw it as lessons. I mean, as far as I can assess it, as in understanding what happens. And if we understand what happens, then should this happen again, and offend, then we know much better than we did this time what we should be doing. And now obviously built into that is the knowledge that this can happen again. You know, whether in any part of Japan. So he sees it as a much sort of broader story. That you know, it's a sort of national lesson. But he doesn't. I mean, it's much more. If we understand this, then that will help us in the future when we have to face these things, which we will have to face. I think he's pretty cautious. I think about sort of jumping out and saying, you know, this will happen, this will happen.
And Colin.
Colin Lewis. Janet, you concluded by referencing the spiritual dimension of the earthquake, and you know, some contemporaries saw it as a punishment. But was the response of government also seen as a test of statecraft by contemporaries? You know, given that there had been the experience of earthquakes in the past and the contemporary gloom, was this seen as now indicating how competent, you know, the imperial state was? And if I could ask a supplementary, I mean, I know that your presentation was very much about the market economy, but I just wonder to what extent did the way in which the state responded to the earthquake help move Japan to a more sort of statist, interventionist economy, which is going to come in the 1930s?
Okay. Right. I mean, in terms of an assessment of statecraft, this is complicated by the fact that when the earthquake hit, Japan had no prime minister. So one of the things they had very rapidly to do was try and find a prime minister. You know, I mean, there was no government in that sense. You have a civil service, you have a bureaucracy, but you don't have political leadership. And so this was very much seen as crisis leadership. You've got to have somebody. Test of statecraft. I mean, it's not something I've looked at in detail, but I think one of the things that you know, to put it in the context of the 1920s, how far did Japanese in the 1920s question, you know, the average Japanese, question the government? You know, it is a hierarchical society. Now, obviously, there were debates about the role of the government. You know, when it comes to sort of price intervention, you've got people in different parts of the country saying this is ridiculous. You know, we don't like this, or whatever it is. But I think the prime objective of the government under those situations would have been regarded as trying to help survivors in the sense of providing them with food, providing them with this. And in terms, I think, of those very basic criteria, the assessment is that they clearly delivered. You know, they provided survivors with food, with temporary housing, that kind of thing. If you come to the sort of broader thing about, you know, what their intervention policies might do for the economy, there are discontents, but I don't think it's sort of seen as statecraft in the sort of, you know, it's just saying this is hurting us, therefore it must be bad, or whatever. So I don't think there's that sort of, you know, assessment. I mean, the amount of questioning of the government per se is pretty limited. Yes, there's you know, some popular discontent, but it you know, the whole structure was not such that people would, I think, sort of question it. I mean, in terms of does it lay the foundations for what goes on later, I don't think it does. Others might disagree. It certainly, I think, helps to. It's very often very difficult to abstract what the government is specifically doing in relation to the earthquake from its broader long-term financial and economic policies, which clearly, you know, have a cumulative effect over time and relate to what happens in the 1930s. That there's no doubt. And so, sort of taking the earthquake out of that is actually, I think, very difficult. But most of the measures that the government takes specifically to intervene are gone pretty quickly. I mean, short-term things like anti-profiteering, you know, that, or import controls, they're 6 months, and then they're lifted, you know, whatever people think. So they're removed. The only element, I think, where it takes much longer is that in relation to what they refer to as the earthquake bills, they back banks to issue bills to support individual businesses and things like that to rebuild. And there's a lot of unsecured credit, which then explodes in the financial crisis of 1927. So that takes longer, and ultimately those problems do feed, I think, into the great, what happens in the Great Depression and the abandonment of the gold standard, which they're compelled to go into. But I don't think, and these governments are very different from the governments in the 1930s, which have a heavy military component. This is a relatively liberal period, relatively, in terms of those who are in government, I think, in that sense, and probably not.
Okay, so we have 2.5 minutes left. And I had 3 questions, but one's withdrawn. So Max, I'm dropping you off the list. I'm sorry, you didn't catch my eye, but is it a quick one?
Yes.
Why don't we have 2 quick questions and maybe some quick answers, but please then ask your questions outside. So go for it.
Just my comment. So my name is Shiba Suzuki. I'm a visiting scholar at SOAS, and I'm professor of economics at Seiki University. And I have published a paper of financial markets during Great Kantō Earthquakes 2 years ago and at KA Shigak. So I'm so excited to today's seminar. And my research reveals that my research is about individual stock prices during the period. So I demonstrated that actually Great Kantō Earthquake has a small impact on average stock price, but there are huge distribution impact. That is, some firms stock price declines sharply, but other firms keep constant, and there are several firms that stock price rise. So I think that the natural disaster has a huge impact on distribution impact, while it is small aggregate impact. So what do you think about the idea that is? So this is only the financial markets, but in general, what do you think about the idea that is natural disaster has, while it is a small impact on average, but it's a huge distribution impact?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I've not looked at the financial markets because obviously so many more expert people are looking at them. But I mean, certainly if you look at the experience of individual businesses, the experience is enormously diverse. Which I suppose is one of the points I was trying to make by these aggregate figures. They just don't tell you that you've got people going in completely different directions. And I mean, certainly the number of bankruptcies is very significant. But then so is the number of new businesses, because people are setting up. So there's a lot of sort of churn in there. So I think you're absolutely right. The sort of dispersal of the experience. And that's quite difficult for a historian to make sense of, because you've got lots of individual stories, and then they don't always match together. And so how do we sort of think about them in a broader sense? No, I'm interested in your work.
Yeah, so I think the recording is about to stop. So before that happens, let me thank Janet for really insightful and thought-provoking. I mean, I think the point about the ripples is really significant, because we're beginning to see from the questions and the talk that the way the ripples sort of keep on rippling and the dimensions of the ripples. So thank you very much, Janet, on behalf of the department.